You're listening to Outcome by Design with Paul Weinstein, a series about the untold stories of the tech world. Let's get into today's episode.
So my guest today is Sean Behr. Sean is a longtime Silicon Valley entrepreneur, executive, and startup veteran. He is currently CEO of Fountain, a hypergrowth startup in the recruiting space. Sean has been a key player in multiple exits, including Shopping.com, which was acquired by eBay, Adapt TV, acquired by AOL, and STRATIM, which was acquired by Car Global. As well as a previous client, Sean is also one of the savviest strategy guys out there, and I am excited he's joining us today. Welcome, Sean.
Paul, it's great to be with you, as always. This time a little more formally, real life.
That's right. Real life, kind of,
Sort of.
Okay, just for background for you and for our listeners, what we do here at Outcome by Design is to try to get a better understanding of why things happen the way they did and extract some of that wisdom to share with our listeners. You know, not the press release version, but all the real life twists and turns that happened along the way. You know, for me, that's the interesting part. For me, those twists and turns aren't just sideshows on the path to success. They are the keys to understanding the whole story. Google buying YouTube, Microsoft buying GitHub. It's not the financial metrics here that make these deals so interesting. It's the strategic element. And that's kind of what we cover in this.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk about it.
Okay, so Stratum. Stratum is such a great story because where it started out and where it ended up are just so different.
Yes.
What you managed to pull off really is nothing short of amazing. I mean, it's a great story. Within a few months, you went from being kind of an on-demand parking app to a tool, kind of a must-have tool for managing fleets of self-driving cars. Now, obviously, you and I work together on this, so I know a little bit of the details, but the listeners are starting from scratch. So I'd like to hear about this from your perspective, right? So, you know, before we dig into all the craziness, set the stage for us. Tell us what you were trying to build in the problem. In the beginning, what were you trying to solve?
Yeah, it's obviously, with the benefit of hindsight, it's been a while, but if you take yourself back 8-9 years ago, right, there was this inflection point where normal everyday tasks were becoming, techized. They were becoming a tech-enabled service, right? And primarily driven by the proliferation of the iPhone and other devices like it. But, things like grocery shopping became something you did with a tech-enabled device. Things like getting a cab ride was something that was made better by the iPhone and the app ecosystem. And so there was a proliferation of companies doing sort of tech-enabled everyday tasks. Like you could get your house cleaned with an app. You could go grocery shopping with an app. You could take a ride with an app. You could get pizza delivered to you with an app. And one of the areas that nobody was working on was parking your car. Like parking your car was this sort of always a difficult experience. Like you drive into a city, you've got to find a parking garage. The parking garage is either full or really expensive. It's kind of opaque pricing of like, it's $19 for the first hour and then, $6 every 30 minutes thereafter. And then, you don't even know where the garage is. And so it was this pain point that was very visceral to so many people. And by the way, I think the pain point is still pretty visceral for most people today when they drive into a city. And so, at the company, we figured, why don't we try to build a tech-enabled service around parking your car? And so we came up with Zerks, which was a on-demand valet parking app, which, you would drive into the city, we tracked your location, a valet parker would meet you at your destination, take the keys for your car, park the car for you. By the way, while you're shopping or eating or working, we'll wash the car, we'll fill it up with gas, do all these amazing things. A very Jetsons-like future. It still remains probably the best product I've ever built. It was an amazing product.
So it actually, it worked.
It worked when it worked. Unfortunately, it was not a very profitable product. It was an extremely challenging economic model. And so very quickly after launching, we realized this is going to be really hard to make a lot of money valet parking people's cars. Obviously, now that I say that, I wish it was so evident back then when we were coming up with the idea, but it was going to be a really difficult model, and we realized we needed to pivot. We needed to do something different. And so what was interesting was somebody said to us, hey, we have a fleet of cars. Could we pretend we valet park the cars with you and then use your software to sort of get those cars filled with gas and maintained and washed? And we don't want to pay you to park them for sure, but we will pay you to use the software to manage it. And of course we said, sure, as long as it doesn't get in the way of our valet parking business. So we did it at night and we did it in the middle of the day. And what was interesting was we lost money in the morning, we made money during the day, and then we lost money at rush hour time in the afternoon. It doesn't take a genius to figure out you should probably stop doing the morning and the evening and just focus on the thing that makes money. And so we pivoted to a fleet management software product, which was really incredible, like an incredible transformation, using the same kind of software, but obviously a big difference. You're selling B2B software versus a B2B app, B2C app. So that's how we got there, but a huge change for the company.
And so you raised $40 million, right, from big name investors, big name VCs. Were they investing in the original idea, or were they investing in the pivoted idea? Where did the pivot come in the fundraising cycle?
Unfortunately, they invested in the first idea, not the second one. So that's a big change. And just to kind of put it in perspective, I mean, the Zerk's valet parking consumer app was built on the premise that everybody was going to drive their own car and arrive at a destination. I mean, why would you take an Uber? Why would you use a self-driving car? You already have a car. It's the future is drivers. And then STRATIM, which was the pivot, was actually like the complete opposite. It was, hey, self-driving cars are really coming. No one's going to drive anymore. And so you had this really big shift, and obviously a big shift for our investors, big shift for our employees, and ultimately a big shift for our partners.
Yeah. Did anybody comment on that? It's like, wait a minute, just like, 2 months ago you were saying, the future is everyone's going to have their own car, and, we're going to have to solve these big logistic problems.
Yeah.
And then 2 months later, it was completely the opposite.
Yeah, there was definitely some comments on there. And I think, look, we had very, very supportive investors who were incredibly patient. But I think, pivots, especially big ones, are just really, really difficult. If you're a bootstrap startup and it's all your money and all your sweat equity, pivots are fine. Your board is yourself. And as long as you're okay with it, you can do that, right? You and your team. Once you take outside capital, you have a whole different paradigm where the person who is the investor's representative basically invested in the first idea, right? They stake their own credibility on the first idea. And so even if your pivot is well-meaning, even if it's well-intentioned, even if it's rationally smart, and even when it works like it did with STRATIM, it is a tough path, right? And a long path. I always talk to founders that, we always have, most of the time we're pivoting. Very rarely do you get the idea and it is perfect and it just like goes from 0 to Instagram in a month. It's usually you're in the right area, but you're kind of off and you need to do 2 or 3 things differently. Those are workable, but when you have to do a big pivot, it's a really big challenge.
Yeah. Okay, so you decided the valet car parking business, the consumer business, was a no-go, and you were going to pivot to a service, kind of a fleet model. So how did you take kind of that and turn that into later what it became? What was the process for you thinking about how do you take this new model and, turn it into something that actually was something that somebody would want and value. Did you think that at this point that, the company was probably more likely to get sold, or do you think that there was a big business in fleet management here?
Yeah, it is and I think most founders go through this where you start these things and you think this is $10 billion public company, no question. When we all know that the likelihood of you building a $10 billion public company it's not 1 in 100. It's 1 in 10,000 or some ridiculous ratio. And, I'll tell the listeners like an interesting story. I did, while we were still doing the valet parking, I sat on a panel with a few other startup founders, all doing sort of on-demand valet, doing some kind of on-demand service with an app. And the moderator sort of said, like, now I know none of these founders would ever sell, but like, let's at least ask the question, are any of you thinking about an exit, even though that would be a really big disappointment? And of course, everybody on the panel said, no, we would never exit. We would never sell. The opportunity is too big. I can assure you, one, no one on that panel is a $10 billion public company. Very few of the people on that panel actually got an exit that returned any capital to their investors. And, there was one company in the time that was not in the parking space that did sell. And boy, that was a great idea. I mean, they returned a lot of capital to their shareholders. They probably did really well themselves, and they got to go work on the next thing that they wanted to go work on. So it was a big change. The reason I bring that story up is it's like once you pivot, and even if you don't pivot, being optimistic about your ability to build a game-changing company while understanding that the very likelihood for you is probably an acquisition. And by the way, a good acquisition is maybe your best outcome, is a really, really difficult thing. And I think for a lot of founders, the acquisition path feels like failure, I guess, or feels like you're giving up somehow. But I think it's easy to miss that, for many people, getting a $50, $100 million exit that's wild success. That is not failure at any level of this. So I think what I did was, once I pivoted, I was really sure that the acquisition was the right path for the company. And so turned my attention heavily towards how do we make sure we can get this acquired?
Okay, so let's talk about that then. You made that decision. You knew the pivot was happening. So how did you get to the point where, you figured out a strategy to involve all these different potential buyers in something? I mean, you had kind of made up this new space that you were in. There was no parallel. It didn't exist. How did you get to the point where, like, all these various different players in the automotive space, were interested in something like that? Where did it all come from?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing we realized was that figuring out, when you typically are building a business, you're very focused on sort of revenue growth, customer growth, gross margin growth, LTV to CAC growth. All those things are really, really important, right? But once you've made the decision that acquisition is your goal, sure, an extra dollar of gross margins helps, right? Obviously, that's not a bad thing. And we had a bunch of people at STRATIM who were focused on the business side, right? But as the leader of the company and the CEO of the company, my focus became, how do I ensure that people see this future that we're painting, and that they see that STRATIM is an important and integral part of that future that's coming. And you wind up sort of spending more of your time, you spend less of your time worrying about sort of gross margins and, customer acquisition cost and more time thinking about who are the companies in the world that might be interested in a broader partnership with you, and how do you establish those connections. And that's really where I spent almost all my time. What's interesting about it, and the reason why I love this like outcome by design, right? There's sort of this like myth that, either you just get lucky. Like you show up at a restaurant and the CEO of some large public tech company is like, oh, I'm looking for things to buy. Like I can't wait. Like what do you do? Because I've got a term sheet right here for you. Um, or that it's just like haphazard. Like, you just go around your life and then one day someone buys you. Like there are things you can do that bring you the outcome you want. It's not a haphazard or a lucky kind of thing. I think one of the great ones from Stratum, just to kind of put this in, and I think this was a brilliant thing that our team did. We decided to become the industry experts in sort of this new world of mobility. Like all the news about car sharing, ride sharing, self-driving cars, fleets in cities. And so we curated sort of what I would call a high-end sort of digestible newsletter. If you want to kind of give it what it would be today, it's sort of like Axios for your industry. And so what we did was we didn't make any money on it. We literally started it, and we knew it was something when people that worked at like major car manufacturers were subscribing to our little newsletter. We're like, we're like the arbiter of what's important to read in this industry. And of course, right at the bottom, it said something like, Stratum is the fleet management solution for the future of the mobility landscape, right? And that gave us like this instant credibility as an industry expert in this new world that's coming. And it was a really interesting hack to sort of become this important player in this new industry.
Yeah, I remember you doing that. And then you ended up having a conference, if I remember correctly, in Miami, and you invited all these guys to come, and they came, right?
Yeah, it was incredible how we went from sort of this small, player to, well, I know I've got to be there and I've got to be on this newsletter and I've got to talk to Stratum to understand what's going to happen in the world of fleet management and mobility and car sharing and ride sharing and other modes of sort of the future of where cars are headed. We became like a must talk to, right? And ultimately those led to really, really fruitful partnerships with, we worked with everybody. I mean, we worked with, I think 5 or 6 major car manufacturers. We worked with the biggest rental car companies in the country. We worked with all of the sort of big new mobility players. We had some kind of a relationship where we were doing work for them. It was really manufactured. It was like an outcome that came out of hard work. By the way, I want to make sure everyone's clear about that. Like, it was hard. It wasn't like, easy, like, oh, we just flipped the switch and, everyone wanted to talk to us. We made intentional decisions that were challenging and hard work to do, but ultimately led to the right thing for us.
Yeah, that's for sure true. Although, I have to say the speed at which it happened was amazing. I mean, we're not talking about years here, we're talking about months. So no one questioned your credibility of moving from a car parking app to one of these essential mobility tools. So you're talking to some of these huge multi-billion-dollar companies, and they're accepting your expertise on this. Or Sean really knows what he's talking about here.
Yeah.
He's really the guy. We got to talk to him. And through that, you think that there was just a lot of paranoia in that industry about changes that were going to happen? I mean, the Uber thing was huge at that time, so they're all thinking about. One of the things I remember was that your personal car spends 10% of its time, if that, on the road, and 90% sitting in a driveway or a parking lot. So, if all the cars are driving themselves, and the utilization of those cars goes from 10% to 30%, then we're going to sell, way less cars. And how does that affect our business? So I'm wondering, is there some sort of all the change and all the fear that was about that change that somehow you capitalized on?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a paranoia in the industry, right? Specifically in the automotive industry. At the time, Uber, right? Uber's kind of come down to earth a little bit in the last couple of years. But at the time, people were talking about Uber as if it were going to be, the next, GE or the next Google. Like it was going to take over the world. And if you're somebody in the business of either selling cars, servicing cars, building parts for cars, if you have a rental car business, I mean, the number of people who said that, the Hertz, Avis, enterprise businesses were going to go away, right? And yet there are people still renting cars at airports, as far as we can tell, even today. But there was this moment where it was extreme paranoia. I think with the benefit of hindsight, I think what we can probably say, and again, with apologies to some of the people who are really working hard at self-driving cars, it's taking a lot longer than anyone thought, and it may take a lot longer than even now, right? I think you and I are years away from having reliable transportation provided without a driver. It's not next month. Again, apologies to very brilliant people who are hard at work at that, and whatever they promise you, they promise you. But I think it's years and years and years away. The thing that's interesting is, again, if you're a founder, if you're a CEO, and you're trying to figure out how to have your company get acquired, right? It is a mindset change to go from, I really care about revenue and week on week growth or month on month growth, to the metrics that I really care about are the people that are likely to buy my company getting more interested in buying my company. It's a very, very different world. And generally those companies are not interested in your revenue, especially with Stratum, which was, compared to some of the companies you're talking to, those companies had market caps that were 20, 30, 40, 50 billion dollars. Even if I were doing $10 million, it's not even a rounding error in their business. They're not buying you because you can bring them some new customers, or you can bring them some new, revenue and gross margin that they didn't have before. They're buying you because you fill some strategic need in their business, either to go after a brand new opportunity or to protect themselves from some other kind of existential threat, right? And I think Stratum fell into the second category, which was for lots of companies who were worried about what will self-driving cars and the Uberification of the auto industry, what will that do to my core business, which delivers a lot of EBITDA today? Well, I'm willing to take a bet and buy this asset in order to sort of have a hedge against, if self-driving cars show up sooner, at least I've got a great asset in this space. So I think that it works, by the way, across any industry. It doesn't happen only in the automotive industry, but it's a mindset shift to say, instead of worrying about how to get a little bit more revenue in my business, my metric that I really care about are the 5 or 6 or 10 companies that might buy me getting closer to buying me, or am I not making progress there?
Yeah. I think from the outside world, it all seems super mysterious. I mean, part of it is because they're not along on the journey, and so they kind of come in the end and they'll read the story in the newspaper or online somewhere. But it seems like just craziness, right? So all these self-driving, all these valet car parking apps get funded at the same time, a few $100 million worth, and then within a period of a year, even months, everyone decides that that's not the right business to be in, and they pivot, and then all of a sudden now self-driving cars. I mean, all this stuff happens so fast, and in the end, the result of it just seems like magic, but. You put a lot of thought into it. There was a lot of okay, here's where we are. Here's the assets that we have right now. What are we going to do with them? What's the best use of them? What industry could really use what we have? And, I think you were just a genius at that. I mean, once you made that decision, you were just 100% shifted in that direction. And you got all these giant companies, and automotive companies are not, the most innovative, right? You're not talking to like, Google or Facebook. This is a very conservative industry. And somehow within, a period of 6 months, 8 months, you got these guys to recognize that there's a tidal wave of change coming and that you're at the cusp of it.
I also think what's interesting about your point, Paul, is that like it's definitely the word I use is like people think it's magical. Like it's like, okay, they raise all this money in this industry, and then a year later they're all doing something else, and then there's like this event, and then you read about it, and it's like, it's sort of like getting to the end of the story and saying, and they lived happily ever after, and you're like, well, what happened? What happened in the 200 pages before they lived happily ever after? What's interesting is it's even magical, I think, to most founders, because the reality is, and I think one of the reasons why, you were so helpful is our pattern recognition is based on, for Sean's pattern recognition, I have 4 opportunities that I can go through this process in a career. It's not like I do this. It's not like I have 20 companies that get acquired in my career. I have 3, 4, right? Sometimes if you're crazy, 5, right? I've been fortunate enough to be part of 3, and I'll be a part of 4. But for most founders, this is their first or second company, and they don't have any sense. Even to them, it's magical. Like, wait, how did you do that? And so that's one of the reasons why I was really excited to talk to you on this podcast, was like, sort of, I want to remove some of the magic from it, while also sort of explaining, hey, like, not only is there no magic involved for many of us in this world, even and especially today, like many of the people who are listening to this podcast in the next 6 months or the next 9 months or the next year or the next 18 months, they're going to face an existential threat on their own startup. And they're going to need to think like, am I going to be a $10 billion company, or do I need to get acquired? And if I do need to get acquired, what do I need to do, right, in order to make that happen, so that one, I can take care of me and my team, but also I can return my shareholders money and make everybody happy and have a win. So I think it's a very timely conversation.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of wisdom there that the listeners will take from that. Just quickly, tell us, how did it all end up with STRATIM, though? If I remember correctly, you had 2 big companies bidding for your company, right?
Yeah, so we wound up with 2 and almost a third. Kind of the other thing I think that's interesting here is, people, you have to talk to founders and they'll say, look, there are like 100 companies that could buy us. I mean, everybody could buy us. And like, not really. There's a very small group of companies that are very likely to buy you. And knowing who those 6, 8, 12, 15 companies, whatever the number is, it's probably not bigger than 15. It's my guess for almost the vast majority of companies. Knowing who they are, we wound up with interest from about 5 or 6. We wound up getting closer with 3. We wound up actually with offers from 2, and ultimately found a great home with Car Global, who obviously still has the STRATIM technology. And I don't work there anymore, but that 3 years ago now. But it was a great landing place and a great team, and I think they're happy with the transaction. We were obviously happy with the transaction, so it all worked out for everybody. But yeah, that's how the story ended.
Yeah, a happy ending. I think the story is amazing. I think the timeline from where you took it from what it once was to what it ultimately became and how that ended up getting acquired is amazing. I mean, it's a credit to, both your flexibility and your savviness that you were able to do that, to create this category of nothing and get all these people bought off on it in such a short period of time. So Good job. Good job. So, to kind of come back to this, you know, if you are trying to give advice to an entrepreneur now who was kind of in the shoes that you were in before, and the pressures that they're under the pressures from their investors and from their employees, and they were sold a vision. I mean, how would you teach them or kind of give them some sort of lessons that would help them think about what they should do in their own circumstances? Obviously, there's a downturn going on right now. A lot of startups are going to be facing these similar issues. So what would you tell them to do, or what would you do if you're in their circumstances again?
Yeah. I've thought a little bit about this, and obviously I talk to lots of CEOs and entrepreneurs, and try my best to help people think through it. The first thing I'm really focused on is time. Ideally, if you want to have an outcome, you should assume it's going to take a year, right? So what I always coach founders about is you want to start thinking about this 18 months before you have to think about it. So if you have 2 years of runway, 2 years of cash, you want to not today, but very soon, you want to start thinking about, am I going to be able to raise more money? And what does that look like? What kind of dilution am I going to have? Is it possible even? And given the current funding environment, that might be a no. It's not possible for you, which means you want to start working on what's my outcome, and you should assume it's going to take 12 to 18 months. That's just, now, might happen sooner, right? But I think one of the important things is those things you read about in the paper where somebody gets acquired, and that deal was signed months ago. Right. And the process of getting to know each other and learning about it probably started a year ago. And there was lots and lots of work in between. So the first thing I always talk about is time. That's on the kind of the how do you make sure you have the option for you and your team and your investors, is to make sure you have enough time to execute a playbook. It's a really critical part of any conversation I have with entrepreneurs and CEOs that are in a similar situation. The second one I always talk about is time, but the other way, right? The thing that is really interesting about this conversation around sort of acquisitions, right, is the only thing you can never get back is time. And I think especially younger, and I'm sure I was this way too, younger, you think you have infinite time. And so why does it bother me to spend an extra 2 or 3 years working on something? That's really easy to say, but when you look back and you say, gosh, I spent 3 years of my life working on this thing that wasn't going to deliver a massive outcome for me or for anybody else I'm working with, right? Boy, could you take those 3 years back and have a different experience or a different journey in those things. So always focused on time as one of the big things I think about, right? But also just the second thing after the time conversation is just realizing that the ability to be acquired, right? First of all, it can be done. It's not rocket science. You can do it. But it will be your full-time job. That is now your full-time job, not worrying about all the other things you have to do in the business. Your full-time job is to get your company acquired, right? And the last thing I kind of talk about, which is a segue from that one, which is, it's very easy to get caught up in the startup ecosystem and believe that, you can be the next Google, whatever it is. And by the way, there might be somebody listening to this who actually is building the next Google, and that's great, right? But what is interesting about it is your number one job is to not run out of money. So CEO's number one job is not strategy, hiring, all those things. Number one job, don't run out of money. Assuming you check the box called there's money in the bank. The second thing about your job is to deliver an outcome for your stakeholders, the people that come work with you, your co-founders, if you're a founder, your co-founders, the people that join you on this journey, yourself, your family. Your first job is to deliver an outcome for those stakeholders. And if you take venture capital, like many of the people who are listening, your job is to return their funds, hopefully more than they give you, right? That's like the goal here, is to return shareholder funds. One of the things I often think about is, if you really want to be a hero, return a venture capital fund with your investment. You do that, you have done everything. Everybody around you will be better. Their lives will be better if you can do that. But like, the focus on it isn't building cool products. Sure, we all love to build great products. The goal isn't to build great products and make websites. The goal is your investors and your employees have given them time, their lives, their energy, and your investors have given you their money. Your goal is to deliver an outcome that makes all of them better. Anyway, that's my soapbox on sort of the advice I give when talking to founders about this.
I mean, obviously, I agree with you on all of that. I think it's one of those positional things. I mean, if you are even an entrepreneur who's been through this more than one time, the odds of getting caught up in your own story are huge. I mean, I almost think that I've been through this, dozens and dozens of times, both as an entrepreneur and, as an advisor. And I wonder if I was back in that same situation, if I wouldn't fall into that same category yet again, all over again. So it's tough. And, obviously a credit to you that you've done that. I mean, I think your story, I think it's super useful for other entrepreneurs to hear. And, if you can move from where you were, as a consumer app to something that was kind of a vital piece in the business ecosystem of the, giant automotive industry in a relatively short period of time, and then have an outcome that was successful, just shows that, these things are possible. It's not magic. There's a method to the whole thing. And obviously that's what I do, but these things do happen. So, on the outside, it does look like kind of like magic. Like, how did that ever happen? But, it's possible. Just because you're not going to become the next Apple or the next Google, doesn't mean what you've built doesn't have value. So I think that's super interesting. So, anything else you want to tell us about, Sean? Tell us about your current projects, about Fountain, about anything else you think that's interesting going on?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, two things I'd say. I mean, one is, I have luckily at Fountain, we've raised a lot of capital, and the company is doing great and growing and doing wonderful things in the world of hiring hourly workers, which is again, taking nothing away from the automotive industry or the e-commerce industry or the advertising industry. There is something fulfilling about building software. I just got this number yesterday. Last year, our customers used our software to hire 3.3 million people around the world. Every one of those people has a name and a cell phone number, and they got the next step in their life, right? Whatever they're doing, whatever job they're getting, it's the next job for them. And so there's something really, really fulfilling about that. The only other thing I would say, in this current funding environment, right? A lot of people say great companies are built in sort of tough times, right? We have this sort of view that there were many great companies birthed in the sort of 2008, 2009, 2010 timeframe, as well as in the 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003. Obviously, shopping.com was in the former. Adapt TV was in the latter, but there were many companies birthed in those, times that needed resilience. I think one of the things that's also true, and I think we're going to see it now, is not only are some great companies being built right now, I think that there are founders and CEOs who, because of the funding environment, are going to quickly figure out that the thing that they're working on is not the thing that they really should be working on. And if it were a flush times, if they just had unlimited capital, they would probably keep working on that thing for years. And because they're not going to be able to raise more money, I actually think what you might see is some companies get acquired, some companies go out of business, but those people that have learned the lesson will take that, and the next company they build could be a really, really big thing. So I think this funding environment will actually lead to some really great things, not only in companies being built right now, but in sort of getting some people that are working on things that maybe aren't going to be the big thing for them, and maybe their second thing will be the big thing for them. So excited to see it. I know it'll be painful, but I do ultimately think it'll be a good win for everybody.
Yeah, I think overall you're right. I think that focus is going to change, and it's going to change from, raising money to building something that matters.
Yeah.
But we'll see. All right. Well, thank you, Sean. Great to have you on the show, and we wish you all the best of luck.
Thanks so much.
You've been listening to Outcome by Design with Paul Weinstein. Don't miss any of our upcoming stories from the tech world. Subscribe to Outcome by Design wherever you get your podcasts. And if you enjoyed this episode, leave us a quick review. You can also send your comments directly to info@paulvweinstein.com. Until next time.